Hello and welcome to the Wargamer, and you're joining me for another Age of Sigmar painting tutorial. This time I'll be showing you how you can paint your Arkanauts in the colours of Barak-Zilfin, and I'll be using the Citadel range of paints to do so. After assembling the miniature, you will first want to prime it. Now I've used a grey spray primer for this, as I find it's a lot easier to paint some of the lighter colours of this miniature on top of it. Now the first task in painting the Arkanaut is to paint his cloth areas. Now for this I'll be using Thunderhawk Blue. Now you want to apply this across the entirety of the cloth areas, breaking up both the trousers and also the jacket. Now, as with all the base layers in this tutorial, I would recommend mixing in a mixture of 2 parts paint to 1 part water. Applying a first layer, allowing this to dry thoroughly before applying a second. This will give you the best coverage of paint possible. The next task in painting the blue cloth is to apply some shading in the recesses. Now for this, I'll be using a wash of Drakenhof Nightshade and applying this over all of the blue cloth we painted in the previous step. Now I've mixed in roughly 1 part water to 1 part Drakenhof Nightshade over the step, as I don't want to be applying the paint too thickly. We just want enough of the wash to pool into the recesses to really bring out the shading and the detail in the cloth. The final step in painting the blue cloth is to apply a highlight of Russ Grey. Now we want to focus this on the raised edges of the cloth. We want to use just a small amount of paint on the tip of our brush, just to lightly drag the brush along these raised sections, creating thin lines of Russ Grey. If you're struggling to get a thin line with your highlights, simply mix in 1 part water to 2 parts paint, and then use just a small amount on the tip of your brush. The next area that we'll be painting will be the leather areas. Now this includes the handle on the weapons, any straps that are across the miniature including belts, and also the wrappings around the legs. Now we'll be painting all of these areas, first of all with Dryad Bark. Next up, we'll be applying a wash over the leather areas that we painted in the previous step. Now for this, I'll be using Agrax Earthshade, and I've thinned it down in the same way as I did previously, as I don't want the wash to be too overpowering. Now one thing you should be exceptionally careful of when applying this wash is that you don't overspill onto the blue areas of the miniature that we've already painted. Simply reduce the amount of wash on your brush when painting around these areas to prevent any overspill. To finish off the brown leather straps of the miniature, I'll now be applying a highlight of Gorthor Brown along the edges. And also have the extra effect of making the detail in these areas really stand out. Again, just use a small amount on the tip of your brush and lightly drag the brush along the edges. The next area of the miniature that I'll be painting will be the remaining leather areas. This includes the boots, the gloves, and any straps along the helmet. Now for this step, I'll be using Abaddon Black. Now this is a base paint, which means it will cover really nicely over the grey spray primer. However, make sure you still use that 2 parts paint to 1 part water ratio that I mentioned earlier. The first step in highlighting the black areas of the miniature is to use Stegadon Scale Green. Highlighting with this colour will help us to tie in with the other blue areas of the miniature by giving us a very slightly bluish black colour to these areas. As with the previous highlights, I'll just be lightly dragging the brush along the edges of the black areas, making sure I can get a thin as line as possible. The second and final highlight to the black areas will give the effect of shiny black leather, and for this I'll be using Thunderhawk Blue. Now instead of focusing this highlight along all of the edges, I'll instead be focusing on strong edges such as the corners and upper sections of the boots. This will create the effect of light hitting these surfaces and being reflected back. The next area of this miniature that I'll be painting will be the bone coloured enamelling on the Arkanaut's helmet. Now for this I'll be using Pallid Wych Flesh. Now over a grey base coat, this should cover quite nicely. However, if you're using a black or different coloured base coat, I would recommend using Rakhar Flesh first. Now I'll be applying this paint on the top of the helmet, around the eyes of the helmet, and also on the small disc on the shoulder pad. You could even use this mixture to paint some of the straps on the Arkanaut as well. With the base coat of Pallid Wych Flesh completed, the next step is to apply some shading in the recesses. Now for this I'll be using a wash of Reikland Fleshshade. Now so that I don't use too overpowering a wash, I want to create a mixture of 2 parts water to 1 part Reikland Fleshshade. This will just apply a small amount of shading in the recesses without staining the colour too much. Once the wash has dried, I'll now be picking out some of the details using Pallid Wych Flesh again. So for example, along the disc you just want to paint around the edges and also the ridges on the helmet and around the eyes. Again, using similar techniques to those used earlier in the video. The next step is to paint the lenses in the Arkanaut's helmet and also any goggles he may be wearing. And for this I'll be using Warpstone Glow. Now be very careful when applying this paint, as you don't want to overspill onto the areas that we've already painted. So make sure you take your time and only use a small amount of paint on the tip of your brush. To finish off painting the goggles and the lenses, we'll be applying a small highlight of Moot Green to these areas. Again, we just want to apply a very small dot on the centre or upper right quadrants of these lenses. This will help to create a coloured glass effect that we're aiming for. With the matte areas of the miniature completed, we can now begin work on the metallics. Now the first area of metal I'll be painting will be the armour itself, and for this I'll be using Brass Scorpion. You will want to apply this over all the metal sections of the Arkanauts suit. Now if you're struggling about which areas to paint, skip to the end of this video and you'll be able to see a full 360 shot of the areas that I've painted on this particular miniature. With the base coat completed, the next step is to apply a layer of Fulgurite Copper. Now this paint is slightly lighter than the Brass Scorpion we used in the previous step, so we want to focus this on the flat areas of the miniature, leaving the Brass Scorpion visible in the recesses. This will help to promote depth and detail in otherwise flat coloured areas. Now before we finish the copper coloured metal areas of the miniature, we want to move on to painting some of the silver areas. Now for this I'll be using Ironbraker. Now I'll be applying this on any of the remaining areas of the miniature, such as the blade, the pistol and any pipes that we may have on the miniature. Now Ironbraker isn't a base paint, which means you may have to apply several thin down coats in order to get the best coverage possible. After applying the base coat of Ironbraker to the metal areas, we now want to wash over them using Nuln Oil. Now this will pool into the recesses and really help to bring out some of the detailing. It will also darken the colour for our later highlight. Again, I would be reluctant to apply this straight out of the pot and instead create a mixture of 1 part water to 1 part Nuln Oil before applying this on the metal areas. The next step is another wash, but we're focusing this mainly on the coppered colour areas of the miniature, and this time I'll be using Agrax Earthshade. Now you want to apply this wash over the entirety of the copper coloured armour, again creating a roughly 1 part wash to 1 part water mixture. However, you can also apply this wash to some of the silver metal areas on the miniature. This will create the effect of dirt and grime that's built up on some of these mechanical parts. Now the very final step in painting our Arkanaut is to highlight the edges of the metal areas using Stormhost Silver. Now you want to approach this step in 2 phases. First of all, when highlighting the coppered coloured areas of the metal, be very subtle in your highlights, be very sparing in your application, focusing mainly on the upper sections and some of the hard edges and rivets. Applying too strong a highlight at this stage will detract from the copper colouring that we've achieved in the previous steps. However, when applying the highlight to the silver metal areas of the miniature, you can afford to be a lot more liberal in your application. So feel free to highlight all of the edges of these silver metal areas. And here we have the completed Arkanaut, painted in the colours of Barak-Zilfin. If you enjoyed this video, please do let me know in the comments below, as well as subscribing to be kept up to date with all of my future content. You can also keep track of what projects I'm currently working on by following my Facebook and Instagram pages, which you can find links to in the description below. If you would like to support me in making more tutorials, you can do so by checking out my Patreon page, which you can find a link to in the description below. From there you can donate to me from as little as $1 a month, which will just really help me in producing future content. So all that's left to say is thanks for watching and goodbye.